What unfolded inside a small church on a rainy Sunday morning in rural Missouri left dozens of people completely speechless. For several long minutes, no one moved. No one spoke. Some would later call it coincidence. Others called it something far greater, a miracle of the Virgin Mary. Even today, the event still divides the town. Some residents insist there must be a logical explanation. Others believe what happened that morning cannot be explained at all. But before we continue, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'm curious to see how far stories like this travel across the world. Not far from that church, out in the quiet countryside of Missouri, lived a horse that every ranch hand in the area feared. His name was Thunder. His coat was a deep, dark sorrel, reddish-brown, almost glowing when sunlight touched it. The name, Thunder, didn't come from his color, though. It came from the sound he made when he ran. When his hooves struck the ground at full speed, the noise rolled across the fields like distant thunder. Thunder lived on the property of Harlan Pute, a 60-year-old farmer who had spent most of his life raising horses. Harlan had worked with dozens of animals over the years. Some were stubborn, some were difficult, but Thunder was something else entirely. He wasn't just hard to handle. He was untouchable. 3 different ranch hands had already tried to break him. Every one of them had failed. Each attempt ended the same way, someone injured. One man had been kicked so hard he couldn't work for weeks. After that, word spread quickly. Nobody in the surrounding farms wanted anything to do with the pasture where Thunder lived. Ranch hands spoke about the horse the way people speak about something dangerous, with a mixture of caution, respect, and fear. More than once, Harlan considered getting rid of the animal. But every time he came close to making that decision, he would look at Thunder standing alone in the field and hesitate. "He's not mean," Harlan would tell the neighbors. "He just doesn't trust anybody." Have you ever seen an animal like that? One that seems completely unreachable, like there's a wall between it and the rest of the world? That Sunday morning began with a heavy gray sky stretching across the countryside. Rain started falling lightly around 8 o'clock. By 9, when the church bell rang through town calling people to Sunday Mass, the rain had turned into a steady downpour, drumming against rooftops and soaking the dirt roads. Inside the small-town church, families slowly filled the wooden pews, the same families who rarely missed a Sunday service. At the front of the church stood Father Sutton, a 55-year-old priest who had served the parish for more than 10 years. He waited patiently as the final people entered and took their seats before beginning the Mass. 3 kilometers away, at Harlan's farm, Thunder was already restless. He paced back and forth across the pasture without stopping. Every crack of thunder made him rear onto his hind legs. Every flash of lightning made him jump backward. In one corner of the pasture stood a wooden shelter Harlan had built so the horses could hide from rain and sun. The other animals had gathered beneath it, packed tightly together as they waited for the storm to pass. But Thunder stayed out in the open, right in the middle of the field. Alone. He was always alone. The storm grew stronger. Lightning tore across the sky. Wind bent the trees violently. Rain hammered the ground. Then suddenly, a lightning bolt struck somewhere very close. The explosion was deafening. The ground seemed to shake, and the entire pasture lit up white for a split second. Have you ever been startled by lightning so close that your entire body jumps? The kind that makes your heart race, and for a moment you feel like the world is falling apart? Now imagine experiencing that. As a wild horse, only a few yards away, Thunder exploded into motion. He shot across the pasture at full speed, ripped straight through the wooden fence, and burst onto the dirt road. From that moment on, nothing could stop him. Inside the farmhouse, Harlan heard the crash of breaking wood. He rushed to the living room window and looked out toward the pasture. The other horses were still huddled under the shelter. But Thunder was gone. "That horse is going to cause some trouble," Harlan muttered. He grabbed his truck keys and ran outside, hoping to catch up with him. But the road was already soaked with rain. The truck's tires spun helplessly in the mud. He tried again. Nothing. Harlan was stuck on the property. Meanwhile, Thunder kept running. He tore past a neighboring farm, smashing through part of another wooden fence as he went. The owner stepped out onto his porch just in time to see a blur of reddish-brown racing past. "What in the world was that?" he asked his wife. By then, Thunder was already far down the road. The horse was exhausted from the wild sprint, but he kept moving, directionless, driven by pure panic. And without anyone realizing it, he ran straight into town. down Main Street, and continued forward as if something invisible were pulling him toward one place. The church. Inside, the Mass continued peacefully. No one had the slightest idea what was about to happen. Father Sutton was reading from Scripture when a strange sound began to echo from outside. At first it blended with the rain striking the roof. But this sound was different. It was heavy, rhythmic, and getting closer. People sitting in the back rows turned toward the open doors. The sound grew louder, deafening. Then suddenly, thunder burst into the church. He crashed through the entrance and charged straight down the center aisle, his hooves slamming against the wooden floor like hammer blows. The entire congregation jumped to their feet. Some people screamed. Others froze completely, unable to react as the massive horse stormed between the pews. At the altar, Father Sutton stopped reading mid-sentence and stepped back against the wall. Imagine being inside that church in that moment. A wild, uncontrollable horse running loose in the middle of Mass. Families trapped between the pews. Nowhere to escape. Thunder continued down the aisle. People pulled back as he passed, pressing themselves against the benches. The horse was exhausted now. Each heavy step made the wooden floor tremble. Have you ever felt that moment when you are certain something terrible is about to happen, and then something completely unexpected occurs instead? Thunder reached the altar, and suddenly, he stopped. No one could explain why. The horse that had been out of control only seconds earlier stood completely still in front of the statue of the Virgin Mary. His breathing slowed. His body relaxed. Then he did something that nobody inside that church was prepared to witness. Thunder slowly lowered his head. It was as if something had calmed him from the inside. All the panic, the fury, the fear simply disappeared. He stood there quietly before the statue, breathing deeper and deeper. The entire church fell silent. No one moved. Some people dropped to their knees. Others began to cry. Father Sutton stepped forward slowly, staring at the unbelievable scene in front of him. Then softly, like a ripple spreading through water, a quiet murmur of prayer began to rise from the pews. And at that exact moment, a young man sitting in the fifth row suddenly stood up. He was about 20 years old. Simple shirt, worn boots, the kind used for working in pastures. He had only come to church because his mother insisted. He wasn't religious. He didn't believe much in faith. But he came anyway just to keep her company. His name was Boyd Kessler. And Boyd recognized that horse immediately. He worked as a ranch hand. He had started at 17 and now, 3 years later, he was still one of the younger workers in the area. He had heard the stories about thunder. He had seen experienced ranch hands walk away injured after trying to handle that animal. Boyd feared the horse just like everyone else. But in that moment, something pushed him forward. His mother, Donna, grabbed his arm tightly. "Boyd, don't," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. He didn't respond. Slowly, he pulled his arm free and stepped into the aisle. Every step echoed through the silent church. Everyone watched. Everyone held their breath. Boyd walked slowly toward Thunder, his eyes locked on the horse. He knew one wrong movement, one loud sound, could send the animal into panic again. And if that happened inside a crowded church, people could get seriously hurt. Can you imagine the courage it takes for a young man to approach a horse that experienced handlers couldn't even touch? Boyd stopped about 6 feet away. He waited. Thunder kept his head lowered before the statue. Boyd stepped forward again, then another step. Carefully, he reached out his hand and touched Thunder's mane. The horse did nothing. Boyd gently ran his fingers through the wet hair. Still no reaction. He slid his hand slowly along the horse's neck. It was the first time anyone had touched Thunder without being kicked, without being thrown to the ground. And Boyd realized immediately something about the horse had changed. This wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. Boyd leaned closer and brought his face near the horse's ear. "What happened, friend?" he whispered softly. "Who brought you here?" Thunder closed his eyes. Boyd remained there for a moment longer, resting his hand on the horse's forehead, speaking quietly, words that nobody else inside the church could hear. Calm words, gentle words, like someone speaking to an old friend. Then Boyd stepped slightly back, grabbed Thunder's mane with both hands, and climbed onto the horse. No saddle, no bridle, just him, and the horse. And there Boyd remained, seated on Thunder's back, right there at the altar of the church, directly in front of the statue of the Virgin Mary. Every person inside the church stared in stunned silence. Boyd gently gave a small command. Thunder began to move. Slowly, calmly. The horse responded to Boyd's guidance as if he had been trained his entire life to follow him. Boyd carefully turned the animal toward the center aisle and guided him toward the church doors. The congregation quietly stepped aside as they passed. No one spoke. They simply watched in disbelief as the same horse that had burst inside moments earlier in a panic now walked peacefully through the church. Boyd's mother stood beside her pew, both hands covering her mouth. Her eyes followed her son as he rode past. She couldn't understand what she was seeing. She couldn't even find the words to speak. Boyd rode Thunder out through the church doors. Outside, the rain had already begun to ease. Inside the church, a strange silence remained. People stood frozen where they were, glancing at each other as if waiting for someone, anyone, to explain what they had just witnessed. Father Sutton slowly returned to the altar. He looked out over the congregation. He opened his mouth to speak. Nothing came out. He tried again. Let's continue with the Mass. But it was impossible to continue as though nothing had happened. People sat down again, but they were restless. Quiet whispers spread through the pews as everyone tried to process what they had seen. Father Sutton eventually ended the service earlier than usual and gave the final blessing. As people began leaving, a crowd gathered near the church doors. They looked down the road where Boyd had ridden away. Some still had tears in their eyes. Others spoke loudly, all at once, sharing their versions of the moment. But Boyd's mother remained seated in the pew. Even after most people had gone, she sat quietly, staring at the statue of the Virgin Mary at the altar, the same statue where Thunder had bowed his head. 5 minutes passed. Then she slowly stood, made the sign of the cross, and left the church. She went home to wait for her son. Outside, the sky was still gray, but the storm had passed. Meanwhile, Boyd was riding Thunder down Main Street. The same people who had seen the horse charging wildly through town earlier were now watching something completely different. Thunder walked calmly beneath Boyd. Every small movement from the young rider guided the horse perfectly. The wild panic from before had completely disappeared. It looked like an entirely different animal. Boyd turned down the road that led back toward Harlan Pute's property. When Boyd arrived, Harlan was standing on his porch. He had tried one more time to free his truck from the mud, but had failed again. Now he stood there worrying about the damage Thunder might have caused in town. Then he saw the young man approaching, riding the horse. Harlan slowly stepped down from the porch and walked into the yard. His mouth hung open. He stared at the unbelievable sight. He stopped himself. Then he asked, "Who are you, son?" Boyd carefully slid down from Thunder's back and stood beside the horse. "My name's Boyd Kessler," he said. "I work as a ranch hand around here." Harlan frowned slightly. Kessler, that name sounds familiar. But before he could think more about it, he looked Boyd over carefully. "You all right?" Harlan asked. "You hurt? Did that horse hurt anybody in town?" "I'm fine," Boyd answered. "And no, nobody got hurt." Harlan gestured toward the horse. "You know what horse that is?" "I do," Boyd said quietly. "I've seen people try to break him before." Harlan shook his head slowly. "Then tell me something," he said. "How did you do this?" Boyd looked at Thunder for a moment. "I didn't," he replied. "He stopped on his own." "Stopped on his own?" Harlan repeated. "Where?" "At the church," Boyd said. "At the altar, right in front of the statue of the Virgin Mary." Harlan stared at Thunder again. The same horse he had considered selling countless times. The same horse that had smashed through a fence just hours earlier and raced down the road completely out of control. Now the animal stood calmly beside a young ranch hand. "That doesn't make any sense," Harlan said quietly. "I know," Boyd replied. "But that's what happened. I was there. The whole church was there. Everyone saw it." Harlan shook his head slowly. "So you're telling me that Thunder ran into a church, stopped in front of a statue, and then let a 20-year-old kid ride him out?" Boyd nodded. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Harlan looked at the horse one more time. Then he turned toward the house. "I'm going to need a very strong cup of coffee to understand this," he muttered as he walked toward the kitchen. Boyd left the property and headed home. When he arrived, his mother was sitting at the kitchen table. A cup of coffee sat in front of her, already cold. She looked up when Boyd walked through the door. "You all right?" she asked immediately. "Yeah," Boyd said. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. For a moment, he simply stared down at his hands. "I can't explain it, Mom," Boyd finally said. "When I stood up in the church, I just knew he wouldn't hurt me. I've never been so certain about anything in my life." His mother watched him silently. Then she reached across the table and gently held his hand. The next morning, Boyd and his mother were having coffee early when the phone rang. Donna answered. "Donna, this is Harlan Pute," said the voice on the other end. "Harlan? It's been a long time," she replied, surprised. "How are you?" "I'm doing all right," Harlan said. "Is Boyd there? I'd like to speak with him." Donna looked across the table at her son. Boyd raised his head, confused. She handed him the phone. "It's Harlan Pute," she said quietly. "The owner of the ranch where your father used to work." Boyd slowly took the phone. "Hello." "Boyd," Harlan said. "I'd like you to come over to the property. Can you make it here today?" "I can," Boyd replied. "I'll come by." He hung up, quickly finished his coffee, kissed his mother on the cheek, asked for her blessing, and headed out. Boyd walked the familiar road toward Harlan's ranch. When he arrived, Harlan was already waiting by the stable. The older man studied Boyd for a moment. Then he spoke. "Your father worked here," Harlan said. "Ray Kessler." Boyd remained silent, listening. "You were just a little boy then," Harlan continued. "About 5 years old. You used to run around this yard while he worked." Boyd said nothing. "Your father was the best ranch hand I ever had," Harlan said. "He had a special gift for breaking horses." Harlan paused for a moment. "When he got sick, everything happened so quickly. After he passed away, I lost contact with your mother. We never spoke again."